If you work in a hospital, there is a chance that you may eventually encounter a spirit, and there have been many doctors, nurses and patients who will attest to the fact that they have seen a genuine ghost. It is no wonder that spirits may abound in hospitals, because other than births, it is a place where most people come to the end stage of their life. The following story is about a young Australian man who, whilst living in London in the 1950s, encountered something that was definitely otherworldly. The following strange incident happened to an Australian man by the name of Ian Jones. Ian was born in Melbourne in 1931 and became a journalist on a Melbourne newspaper called the Sun News Pictorial. In January 1956, like many young Australians, he headed to England when he was 24, where he wanted to study television. In those days, most people living in Australia travelled by ship, and Ian went on an ocean liner called Strathaired. The voyage to London would take him 1 month, and after working 3 chaotic years as a journalist, the month-long voyage was pure joy filled with much sun-soaking and leisure. Ian spent most of his leisure time walking around the decks in his bare feet, but unfortunately a blood blister formed under a callus on one of his toes, and his toe became badly infected, and despite being treated by the ship's doctor with penicillin injections, he arrived in London with a very painful and swollen foot. He made his way to Earl's Court in Kensington, which in those days was full of expat Australians. Unfortunately, because his foot was so badly infected, he became an outpatient at the nearby St Mary Abbots Hospital. Whilst being treated, he started to suffer with terrible back pain every time he breathed, and because his infected foot had worsened, he had to be admitted to the hospital. Shortly after entering the ward, he had another painful episode of back pain where a nurse had to give him morphine before officially checking him into the hospital. When the morphine started to kick in, he started to feel euphoric. After much care by the nurses and hospital staff, he would eventually recover, but was told that his back pain was caused by pleurisy, where a spot on his lung had become infected. He was advised that he had been seriously ill. One evening, while still recovering in the ward, he decided he wanted to try and have a normal night's sleep, so he declined any painkillers or sleeping pills. His room was in darkness, apart from the lights coming from the courtyard below, which shone up through the curtains that bathed the room with a soft glow. At this point, he fortunately had no discomfort and was feeling totally relaxed and felt himself slowly drifting off to sleep. But suddenly, he had a strange feeling that there was someone else in the room, and as he opened his eyes, he saw a nurse at the foot of his bed. He first figured that she'd come into the room to check on his welfare and whether he'd fallen asleep. She appeared to be turning to leave, but as she turned towards the door, she quickly glanced back at him. Ian was about to say to her, "It's okay, I'm not asleep," when several things came to his attention, and he thought, "This is not a nurse that I recognise." She was blonde and not wearing the normal starched folded headwear that he usually saw of the hospital, and she was not wearing an apron. She was dressed nothing like the nurses that he'd been regularly seeing in St Mary Abbots Hospital. The uniform on this particular nurse was in navy blue with light-coloured piping that made her look like she belonged to the military. But there was one particular detail that stood out with the nurse, and that only her head and shoulders were visible, which appeared to be level with the top of the slightly open door. But where was the rest of her? He had no sooner registered what was happening when she abruptly vanished. Ian was left staring at an empty space that the nurse had once occupied, and quickly turned on the light to get more clarity, but there was nothing to be seen. He listened for any possible sound of her footsteps, but all he could hear was someone coughing in another ward. He checked the time of the incident and recorded it in his diary, where he wrote the heading "Ghost Nurse" and lay back on his pillow, contemplate the strange thing he'd just experienced. However, the image of the blonde nurse in military-style uniform stayed with him till he drifted off to sleep. The following morning, one of the regular nurses entered his room, called Sister Brady, and he asked her whether St Mary Abbots Hospital was haunted. The nurse was not at all perturbed by his unusual question, and replied in a lilting Irish accent, "And which one have you seen, Mr. Jones?" She then told him that the hospital had several ghosts, including an old man who wears a nightshirt who was often seen wandering around the wards. New nurses often make comments about him. The senior staff were well aware of his presence and did not want the new nurses to worry when on night duty. They said that he knew who he was and would often see him. When Ian described the ghost nurse in detail and the unusual uniform she was wearing, Sister Brady looked at him with a curious expression and said, "No one has ever described that particular nurse to me. However, the nurse you are describing fits the image of an auxiliary nurse who was killed in the hospital during an air raid in 1944. Ian said that he was left with a mystery as to why a nurse who had been dead for 12 years specifically visited him when nobody else had ever seen her. He believes the answer lies in the fact that he was visited by the nurse because he'd been very close to death. He was advised by a specialist that his pleurisy had been caused by infected material from his toe entering his bloodstream, forcing its way into his left lung, which caused agonizing pain and almost killed him. The specialist said that his life had been in great danger. Ian believes the ghost nurse only visits those whose life was in grave danger. When she saw he was out of harm's way, she left the room. Ian feels that other patients have also probably seen her, but they did not live to tell of their experience because they died before they could tell anyone. Ian Jones saw her and lived to tell the tale. Ian later returned to his hometown in Melbourne, Australia, and went on to become a successful television writer and director, and was also an author who specialised in the history of notorious Australian bushranger Ned Kelly and his gang. Unfortunately, Ian Jones passed away on the 31st of August 2018 at the age of 86.